We are living in a world where there are economic forces behind migration which are very, very powerful, both for the individuals driving them to behave in certain ways. Sometimes, when I was Home Secretary and a Minister in the Home Office, there are people who behaved in the most extraordinary ways to be able to get into this country, putting themselves at the most dreadful risk. One of the most terrible things I ever did was as Minister of State at the Home Office and going to see the container where 50 people had died coming across from Holland because they'd desperately been trying to get to this country. And people would do the most incredible things to be able to do this. And those economic forces on individuals, on companies, on employers and so on are very, very large. And whatever rules you put in place, it's not the case that one can simply say, we put the rule in and that's it. Now, other basic points. What people want is a sense that they know what's happening, that people who are here are entitled to be here, have followed the rules in some kind of general way, and that it's a proper system that has worked well. They want secure rules, they want to understand what the rules are, and to be sure they're being enforced properly. And that is what people are looking for, and that slogan, which was so powerful in the Leave campaign, "Take Back Control," I think summed up what many, many millions of people in this country thought. They wanted to feel that they were in control of the situation, and they felt that they weren't in control of the situation. The kind of caricature debate about immigration, that there's lots of people who want completely uncontrolled migration on the one hand, and on the other hand, migrants who want to be stopped, and you simply have to have walls along the Donald Trump model in Mexico. That's a caricature debate. There are very few people who believe there should be uncontrolled migration, and very few people who believe you should simply have a wall that stops anybody coming through. The issue is, what are the rules that govern migration? How are they being enforced? Are they effectively being carried through? And the impact of migration, I mentioned the overall economic areas, the pressure points on public services, which people have been very worried about. And there are undoubtedly people in some parts of the country, some near here, who worry about the impact on hospitals or whatever of migrants. Actually, all the evidence, I know it's derided experts in this, is that the pressure on public services and on employment and so on from migration is very particular in a very limited number of parts of the country, where it's entirely possible to put in systems to deal with that and to deal with it properly. It's not the case there is a general pressure on public services. It's not the case there's a general downward impact on wages, for example, of people coming in particular areas. There are particular aspects which are there, but many of the concerns that people genuinely have are in fact not right. I was involved at the University College London producing a document going through all of these issues, the impact on health, the impact on education, the impact on housing, the impact on jobs, and so on. And actually, they are not very substantial in the great scale of things. The example that Heather gave of the former Prime Minister trying to negotiate a deal on use of benefits, there isn't substantial migrants taking up benefits in ways which are taking money away from us in a variety of different ways. It's all very well, of course, for me to say that, but actually millions of people don't believe it. They think it's part of the old governing class, as it were, hiding from the truth of the situation. But it brings me to the next point, which is this distorted nature of public debate about these things. It's now become very difficult to have a proper public debate about the real impact as opposed to the perceived impact. And I emphasize it's not because people are racist, it's not because people aren't trying to be honest about the situation. It is perceptions, but the realities are often very different. Now, if one talks about the economic impacts, the impact on wages I've mentioned, but one big issue is drawn out very strongly in Heather's presentation, the impact on the supply of labour. I think there really is an issue on the migration issue, how in the kind of industries she was describing, food and drink, hospitality and so on, employers will actually get the workers that they need to provide those businesses in the way that they want. And that's why the concerns are there. And you can see it physically in many ways as you go around. You look at the health service and see the large number of people from the EU and elsewhere who are working in the health service. And if you simply abstracted that, it would be a very difficult situation to be able to keep the show on the road. And so the impact is very significant. And finally, the elephant in the room as a general point. which people don't talk about enough, but is a core issue. In the issues about why British young people born and brought up in Britain aren't going for these jobs, there is a massive question about the way our skills, vocational training and so on has worked for people in schools and colleges. There is a section of the population who, for whatever reason, and one can discuss this at great length, it's an issue which preoccupied me when I was Secretary of State for Education and Skills, are not optimistic about the possibility of getting work and being able to do the kinds of jobs we're talking about. Why is that? Is it that they're generally unattractive? Is it that the skills simply aren't there, or whatever? The only positive side I can see out of the Brexit decision is the possibility, and I must say I think it's only a possibility rather than a probability, that there will be a serious effort to try and ensure that people in that position do get the skills and qualifications to be able to take the jobs that we're talking about. I'm quite sceptical whether it will actually happen, because actually there were major efforts made to try and provide high quality skills and education for people well before this whole debate took place. But there is a serious question for the UK about the extent to which our education and training system enables our young people in particular, but it could be our old people, it could be people working later, as Heather implied, are able to do the work in these sectors. So if there are no migrants able to fill those millions of jobs in food and drink, hospitality, social care and so on, can we provide that from the rest of our country with proper skills, education and training? Now, what I really want to look at is three different migration relationships. Firstly, the UK with non-EU countries. Secondly, the EU with the rest of the world. And thirdly, the UK and the EU, because they're three different sets of migration relationship. All of them address the fact that there are basically four different forms of migration that happen. Migration to work, i.e. migration to get a job. Migration to study, which we know very well here at this university. Migration to unite with family or friends, all kinds of rules about that. And people seeking asylum, which isn't strictly migration. It is nevertheless, of course, where we are legally obliged to offer asylum to people who are fleeing torture, tyranny, and so on. In the case of the UK non-EU issue, as Heather rightly said, I was the Home Secretary, introduced the white paper in February 2005 called Controlling Our Borders, Making Migration Work for Britain. And that was after a number of things had happened. And we decided as a government, and I decided as Home Secretary, that it was crucial that we try and answer the questions which I've set out earlier in what I'm saying. What are the rules about who's entitled to come and work here, to migrate to work? What people would we accept? What people would we not accept? What's the basis of it? Similarly, what are the rules for people who want to study here? What are the rules for family reunification? And what are the basic operation of the asylum system that makes it work? I believed, I don't think naively, though some might think I was naive, that if we set out those rules very clearly, that people would accept that there were a set of rules that operated, and if we then enforced it, and there are serious issues and difficulties about enforcing it, that people would accept that we'd got a migration process between non-EU countries and the UK, which would give people confidence that migration was in the interest of the country. The figures which Heather gave in her presentation illustrated that situation. 196,000 was the figure she gave in the most recent figures of people coming by that route. 196,000 compared with the total 100,000 from everywhere in the world, EU and non-EU, which David Cameron set as the target for his government. In terms of taking back control, that UK non-EU migration relationship, it was quite possible for Theresa May, during her period as Home Secretary for 6 years, to put a complete wall in that position and say 0 people will come from the non-EU countries to work in that country. Why didn't she do that? She did it because the economic and other pressures that I've described were very powerful. She tried to attack certain categories. For example, the 47% of students, and she worked very, very hard to try and discourage students from coming to study in this country. And all of you here associated with the university will know how very strongly the universities as a whole across the whole country sought to resist that, both for the, I think, correct reasons that educationally it is beneficial to have people from across the world coming, but also economically it was extremely important for this university, in fact for universities throughout the country, to have students paying substantial amounts of money to study here, and that benefited the situation more generally. So when she tried to stop that channel of migrants, there was a big counter-reaction. When David Cameron as Prime Minister went to India to try and talk about our overall policies, the Indians are saying, we don't really want to talk to you if you're going to stop our students coming to study in the UK, a problem that Theresa May had when she went as Prime Minister as well. The point I'm trying to make is in each of these categories, the reason why just picking a number, and I was very careful in my white paper in February 2005 not to pick a number, but in fact to choose rules and criteria that should operate, is the number gets undermined and in fact becomes unenforceable. And by the way, my prediction is that's what's going to happen on the EU migration side as well, because these forces are so large that governments can't resist them. So in the UK non-EU thing, we established in that white paper a points-based system for people coming to work, which said you're only entitled to come and work in this country if you fulfill certain requirements according to where we need workers in this country, and it could be short-term. So you could say if we've got a shortage of workers in a particular area, you're welcome to come for the next 2 or 3 years, but we hope to educate and train people that makes that unnecessary in the future. But actually, the point system was, as Heather rightly described, bureaucratic in its way it worked, and it didn't really succeed as a force in actually driving down the numbers. On the other hand, as Heather's graph demonstrated, as a direct result of that white paper was a decline in the migrants from non-EU countries, because we had got a control in that process which tried to deal with it in a better way. I don't defend the white paper absolutely. I think there were some mistakes in it, but I do think it was a fairly coherent attempt to try and get some control, some criteria, some operating system that worked for people coming to the UK from non-EU countries. Of course, around the whole of this debate, all kinds of issues about people who were here, should they have been here, lots of media discussion about particular individuals, highlighted, of course, when people who shouldn't have been here, who came here illegally, committed terrible crimes. I remember a police officer killed by an illegal migrant in Yorkshire, and rightly there was outrage throughout the country about this being the case, and the question being, why was this person ever in the country able to commit this appalling crime? And so the argument builds up in the situation that it is. That was the UK non-EU, and I would claim that that white paper in February 2005 was the first real effort to get a coherent policy about these areas. And it did reflect failures in the government policies prior to that, because on people claiming asylum in this country, we simply had left them for years with people claiming asylum but unable to get a proper decision out of the situation. There were very large rooms full of files which were unopened and had been unopened because the system was overwhelmed by what had happened, and gradually that was got hold of. That problem's, I think, gone now, but it was a real issue in that area. The second big relationship, which actually I think has dominated the debate in this country about migration, has been that between the EU and the rest of the world, and the question of what happened. Of course, we've all seen the terrible tragedies across the Mediterranean as people have been coming in and killed in that way, large numbers of people coming in, massive tensions arising as a result of that approach. Angela Merkel taking a very big decision to allow a large number of people to come, mainly fleeing from Syria, into Germany, which has then led to a situation where she's under pressure politically in her own country on that. An agreement between the European Union and Turkey to try and resolve that situation. I wrote a pamphlet about this in November 2011 called The EU and Migration, A Call for Action. There's a few more copies down there at the front if anybody's interested to pick them up later, in which I argued for a far more coherent approach by the EU as a whole, I was no longer in Parliament by then, to deal with migration into the EU from the rest of the world, because I thought it was not being done properly and not being done effectively. of which the single most important thing was to have a secure border of the EU around the so-called Schengen zone countries. And it's in fact a very ineffective border, as you can see in your television screens on many different occasions. And a whole set of issues in which I set out proposals where I thought that the EU ought to work more effectively in this area. It involves the relationship between the EU and its neighbouring countries to reduce migration. It involves a much stronger position across the southern border of the EU to North Africa, the Maghreb countries. It involves a much more coherent attack on the people traffickers who make billions of pounds out of exploiting people's misery in a whole variety of different ways. It requires more effective border agencies, more effective approach on returns of people who aren't entitled to be here. But overall, it requires a holistic approach that says we are going to tackle this issue. I feel rather, I hesitate to say bitter, but almost bitter about this, because I feel the EU leaderships over that era, right across the EU, did not grasp this issue. And it was an entirely predictable issue. Thousands of people were killed crossing the Mediterranean who needn't have been. The issues might not have been taken place. And it was all because the EU's leaders, all of them, including the UK, but by no means only the UK, were not prepared to say how did we deal with this situation in an effective way. And I think there were ways to deal with it in an effective way. And I think had that been done, the whole context of the debate that we've now got would be completely different. I think those images in every household of the disasters that had happened and of hundreds of thousands of people coming into the EU in that way destroyed and damaged the whole debate in a very serious way. For me, it weakened my confidence in the capacity of the EU to tackle really difficult problems. Its two difficult problems have been the Eurozone and getting that right on the one hand, and the migration issue. And it wasn't dealing with those issues as it had dealt with issues in the past. And I think that one of the reasons in the medium term for the failure of the Remain side to win the referendum last year was that making the case that the EU was doing a very good job on the challenges that faced the European Union was quite difficult. And this was a very good example of that particular fact. And there's lots of reasons for that, which I can go into in answers to questions if anybody's interested. But I think unless you sort out that EU rest of the world relationship, whether we're in or out of the EU, we will have a problem on migration over these issues as well. And I think that will continue to be an issue. You then turn to the third of these relationships, the UK and the EU. And I thought actually that Heather's figures almost made the whole case. She has 72% of people from the EU coming to work in the coming to the UK to work, 41% with jobs, 31% looking for work. A pretty small proportion, 13%, coming to study, and even smaller proportions for any of the other reasons. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about could we provide a better UK-EU migration system. It's wrong to say that the Treaty of Rome says there has to be absolute freedom of movement within the EU. It is simply not the case, and there's been some very good work done by various people on this. It does require freedom of movement to work, but not freedom of movement not to work. But that's actually been quite difficult to enforce, and so gradually has got eroded over time, and has led to a situation where people are not clear quite who's here, why, and what the situation is. And that's why various people have suggested that there may be solutions of tying the freedom of movement to work again much more tightly in a way that means you can only come to work, and that there's a basis of trying to find different rules which make the situation slightly more controlled than it is at the moment. I think the issue is whether you go down a line which I think Theresa May has decided to learn from the referendum, which is you have to block all migration from the EU, which I think is both foolish and won't succeed, or whether you find a better choice of finding a more sophisticated means of control of those areas, look for allies in the EU who are going to support that and put that in place, perhaps around work permits, perhaps around ID cards, perhaps around various different aspects of what could be done. But it's very important to recognise, I mentioned the uncertainty that we're talking about, that the European Union itself will not be the same at the end of this year as it is now. We'll have new governments in France, we don't know yet what government, in Germany. The other side of this negotiation is going to be very different indeed. François Fillon, if he's elected, which I think he probably won't be now, the Conservative in France, because of a personal issue about paying his wife, was already arguing for establishing new immigration rules within the Schengen zone if he were elected president. And if France were to do that, I don't mean a Marine Le Pen situation, but any new French president was to say we've got to go back to the drawing board on this and see how we control migration within the Schengen zone, it becomes far, far more possible to imagine a UK government EU agreement on tighter controls of migration between the UK and the EU. Now, I can't say exactly what the nature of that agreement would be, but I think the idea that says there's no possibility of any change in these areas is not right. And in fact, I think one should be looking to see what forms of controls should be there and tying it far more to work. As far as study is concerned, I've argued for a long time, along with David Richardson's predecessor as Vice-Chancellor of this university, that students should be taken entirely out of the measurement of the area. It's in the best interest of both universities and for students to take students out of the process. All the evidence is that they're not long-term residents in this country, they're not a major burden, but in fact a major support to the country in a variety of different ways. But I can imagine finding solutions on the UK-EU thing, which would mean more control in that situation and to carry it forward. What about UK people going to live elsewhere in the EU? And I'm grateful to Heather for the figures here. The British population living outside the UK is increasing, but mostly outside the EU. It's estimated that 1.2 million UK-born people are living in other EU countries. Spain, 310,000, Ireland, 250,000, France, 190,000. We have the fifth highest migrant population in the EU after Poland, Romania, Germany, Italy. Pensioners are the biggest group. Big issue that is pensioners. Big implications for pensions, obviously, but also access to healthcare. Now, I believe some of the scares that people are having about people being forced to come back to the UK from Spain, for example, are not the case. I don't think that will happen. I think there will be an agreement that means that people can be where they are, and I think people should try as best they can to stay as calm as they can in the situation. So what's my conclusion, Hussein? It is, firstly, there are these big factors which drive migration, the economic factors, the way in which it's debated in the country, and so on, which are there whatever set of rules you have. The idea that we will be able absolutely to control the situation is not right. Secondly, that I think you have to look at the three things separately: UK non-EU, EU rest of the world, and UK EU. I think UK non-EU, the government has the power today to do what it wants on numbers in those kind of issues, and the reason it doesn't is because those economic forces are very large. EU rest of the world, I think, is a disaster, and the EU hasn't done what it needs to do, and I continue to argue in various ways, in various campaign groups and pressure groups and so on, to try and get the EU to face up to those questions, because the big migration story is rest of the world to EU, which then comes on, and we have not got control of that, and more important, the populations of Europe, not just in the UK, the Brexit vote or whatever, but in every country of Europe are worried about this state of affairs, and the EU has to get hold of it. And then in the third dimension, the UK-EU dimension, to look much more particularly at what controls we could put in that would weaken people's concerns about what is happening. It's obvious from the figures that Heather presented that our biggest migration issue is not the issue of migration from the EU, though that is the issue that people have been most concerned about. We need proper rules rather than numeric targets. Just saying a certain number that doesn't relate doesn't help. We need the system to manage the pressures that come through. And we have to deal with these labour supply issues, because if business is going to close down because they can't find the labour for what they do, the economic knock-on will be very substantial. I haven't dwelt on that, Hussein, here, but all the economic research suggests that if migration reduces, our general wealth will decrease, quite apart from, I'm not talking about the single market and all those issues. There'll be a whole set of issues which will be problematic. It does mean focusing on skills for young people. It does mean regulating the labour market and trying to stop exploitation. And it does mean attacking people trafficking in a very particular way. So that's my supplement to Heather's excellent presentation. It's a very important and interesting subject, but not subject to the simplicities which some of the public debate about it suggests. It's a much more complicated issue than people think. Thank you.